Hello and welcome. I'm Peter Kurti, a research fellow at the CIS, and it's a great pleasure to have your company for an important conversation about merit, about how best to go about allocating rewards and benefits and opportunities in our society. Have we got this allocation right? Australians are committed to the idea of the fair go, an egalitarian ideal expressing the idea that people should have a decent chance of success in life. But even in a fair go society, do some people, by their efforts and talents, deserve more than others? According to philosopher Michael Sandel, merit began its career as the empowering idea that we can, through work and faith, bend God's grace in our favor. And the name sometimes given to the social order built around the idea of reward for ability and effort, or merit, is meritocracy. Meritocracy purports to promote opportunity and equality by distributing social and economic rewards on the basis of talent and ability rather than inherited status. It certainly sounds like something liberals who are committed to individual liberty and freedom of speech should endorse. But could it be that meritocracy comes to blight Australia in the future? What if the gap between equal outcomes, where outcomes are broadly similar, grow large enough to deny equal opportunities, where similar opportunities are available to all? Can we bank on merit? Well, to discuss these questions, I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Stephen Schwartz, a former Vice-Chancellor of 3 universities, Murdoch and Macquarie here in Australia, and Brunel in the United Kingdom. Stephen is also a Senior Fellow at the CIS. And the Honourable Dr. Gary Johns, until recently Commissioner of the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profit Commission, and now an Adjunct Fellow with the CIS. Stephen and Gary, welcome to you both, and thank you for joining me.
Pleasure, Peter.
Well, Steve, let me begin with you, because one of the topics around merit that's frequently discussed is the allocation of university places. Everyone should have the same opportunity to study at a university if their ability, assessed by marks, warrants it. But when deciding whether or not to give a student a place at university, is it right to assess merit on one factor alone, that is, on marks or exam results?
You know, Peter, I'm experiencing a little deja vu here, because this isn't the first time I've been asked, actually confronted with that question. Some years ago, I participated in a debate in the Oxford Union, a venerable debating society. And the motion before the House that evening was university admissions should not be based on marks alone. And I was there because I had conducted a controversial British government review on admissions to universities. And I was known to favor that motion. And my opponents were led by former Chief Inspector of Schools. And in the debate, he and his team compared university applicants to runners in a foot race. And just as the runner with the fastest speed wins the race, applicants with the highest marks and the highest entrance examination scores deserve to be selected for university admission. And they argued that anything other than academic performance, using anything else, the quality of the schools an applicants attended, or their family income, or any obstacles they may have had to overcome to get to where they were, all of that would be unfair, because it could mean that someone with lower marks would get ahead of someone with higher ones. Now, I thought at the time that I really had the answer to this. And I said that foot race analogy was flawed, because in a race, all the runners start from the same place. But that's not always true in life. Wealthy families can provide their children with high quality education, extra tutoring, cultural experiences. Some applicants are not that fortunate. They're disadvantaged. They're disadvantaged by illness or poverty or circumstances. And it's possible that their marks don't reflect their true potential. You can't make sure that everyone has a privileged upbringing, but you could make admissions fairer. The playing field could be leveled a bit by giving every applicant with talent and brains and ambition some chance to demonstrate their abilities, even if marks were not as high as you would like to use. Otherwise, it seems to me that the foot race is more like a foot race in which some people are doped and given an advantage. But the reason I'm telling you this long story is I lost that debate. And I went on to lose another one on a similar topic at the Cambridge Union. And in both cases, the student audience, those are the ones who served as the judges, they believed that they deserved admission to the university because of their higher marks and voted accordingly. Now, it's not surprising that students who manage to make it into elite universities hold this view. But what is surprising is that the view is held by almost everyone, including people who are nowhere near the top of the social ladder. In a Pew, a think tank, did a research, attitudinal poll in the USA, and they found that in every demographic category, whether it's blacks or whites or old or young or Asians or Latino or disadvantaged or Republicans or Democrats, every single category, a majority of people believe that universities should be based on academic marks alone and nothing else should matter. And it seems to me that this is such a strongly held view and so strongly held by so many people across the country and across the demographic issues that it's hard to argue that anything else is fair.
Gary, do you think that merit when it comes to university places should be determined by marks alone, or can we expand the concept of merit as Stephen has been arguing?
Well, let's pick up Stephen's comment about talent. If marks are a sufficient measure of talent, then marks are useful and perhaps soundly measure. But there may be other ways to measure talent, but you'd have to convince me and many others that talent can be better measured by other than marks. And in some ways it is. People going through to medicine, I understand now, have to have all sorts of interviews and so on to answer this question. Could they make the best use of the investment in which we make in their education? So we've got to think of the ends here. Not everyone's going to go to university. University is just one part of an expansive way in which we're all educated, whether it's at TAFE or on the tools or in the family business. So we don't want to get too wrapped up in university as such. But nevertheless, universities are a very expensive deal. And if we let people use those scarce resources who will fail, then I think that's a bad use of resources. So to sum up, unless we have a better measure of talent than marks, I would stick with marks, perhaps supplemented by an interview.
May I say, perhaps to make my position just a little bit clearer, I don't think we should take people into, and in fact, it was the number one recommendation, we should never accept students into a university we expect to fail. I mean, that's just a cynical way of going about business. We're looking for talent and people who will succeed. And I would say that it sounds like things like what school you went to would be irrelevant, but it turns out not to be, because we sponsored some research projects and they showed pretty well and actually repeated elsewhere that students who went to deprived schools and managed to get similar marks to people who went to much more well-resourced schools and who came from families that could afford tutoring, those students are actually a better bet at university because they've got the grit to struggle through even in difficult situations like a poorly financed and resourced school. So my feeling is if it's relevant and it helps you pick up the people who are really capable, then we should go beyond marks.
Well, Gary, let me ask you this, picking up a point that you just made. Do we need to reframe the idea of equality of opportunity? Because it's one form of a non-discrimination norm that classical liberals generally consider an essential component of fairness, applications open to all, selection based on merit and the rest. But isn't the problem that this assumes that it's always the same kind of opportunity, say the university education that we've been talking about, that must be available to all? Do we need to, and you've really touched on this, I think, do we need to reframe the idea of equality of opportunity itself?
Yes, in as much as I think let me be slightly controversial, I think we've overinvested in university education. Far too many people are going to that place and failing. Or courses are being adjusted so that they get through but the question is, do they benefit? So there's a lot of credentialism there being sucked up by universities. There are other places, technical and further education and adult education and so on, I think are fine places where people can go and find the skills that they need. I think the key here is, are we excluding people on a wrongful basis from institutions where they might gain a significant benefit? Now, if there's no rule that says you can't be excluded other than on merit, and we'll debate what the measure is, then I don't see the problem. We're not excluding people. I'm a big fan of Angus Deaton, the economist, who tells us that inequality is a consequence of progress. So in other words, let people's talents shine. We will get inequality, but in letting them shine, I think we'll all be much better off.
Well, John Rawls, the distinguished legal philosopher, proposed what he called fair equality of opportunity, whereby justice requires arrangement of institutions such that all persons with the same talent and ambition should have identical chances of competitive success. Stephen, if we accept Rawls's fair equality of opportunity principle, how do we account for the passing of social advantage and privilege from parents to children? Because isn't this what meritocracy was intended is intended to accomplish, that privilege isn't just passed down in the way it is with an aristocracy, and yet it seems that that's actually started to happen now. Doesn't Rawls's principle really require a kind of classless society in which no one enjoys social prestige?
Up to a point. Can I answer with two different points? One carries over from our previous discussion. Competition for university places and the discussion about them is usually about elite universities or about certain courses. It's not about all universities, right? Most universities in Australia don't select students. They go out and recruit them and hope they find them, right? It's not like they're sitting there turning people away. We're really talking about a very small number of institutions or courses where these are essentially the marshalling yards for the gravy train of life, Peter. These are places where change your entire outlook on life and your entire prospects on life will be changed by attending. And that's where all these focuses have been, on those areas where there's a lot of demand and not much supply. The average university is not really relevant to any of this. They accept everyone, or pretty much everyone. Getting back to your other question, but Rawls himself recognized that you're almost always going to have inequality in a society because ability is different in different people. And so some skills are innate, some abilities are innate, even the drive to succeed might be innate. And we reward with our esteem and financially people who are successful at contributing to the general welfare and the general good of the community. So if people invent a new word processor and it makes a big difference to our productivity, those people are rewarded accordingly. And that's how society progresses. And I don't think Rawls denied that. What he said is that every inequality that existed would somehow be justified, or should be, by how well it helps the people at the bottom. Mm. So if it helps people at the bottom, for there be some people who are rewarded at the top, I don't think he'd see that as an unfair or unexpected outcome. And that's how I see it as well, that even Adam Smith talked about esteem. People desire esteem and they desire to be esteem worthy, and they get rewarded for that. And that's a good thing. That's how we progress in life. And Rawls made provisions for that in his own theory.
Peter, could I just sort of add to that? It seems to me that Rawls essentially was talking about an insurance model. Remember, he had that sort of cloak of secrecy, or whereby he would say, if we were starting again, you may not make it in the next life, if you like. So what arrangements would you like? And most people would seek some assurance, literally insurance, that if it didn't work out so well, they could fall back on. Now, the good thing is, Rawls in practice happens 24/7, 365 days a year through democracy. Every election we have at state and federal level, to some extent, is this push between those who would like more insurance, that is more transfer payments, welfare payments and so on, and those who would like to be taxed less for their efforts. So the beauty is in the institutions. I think our institutions do allow for this push and pull constantly, because we will never settle on a final set of arrangements over this question of merit or equality of opportunity. But the beauty is that it's always there. We're always contesting it because of the democratic process.
Yes, I mean, I think the principle you're referring to is the veil of ignorance principle in Rawls, and what he was trying to do, I think, was to take the sting out of the idea that people would face unequal opportunities and unequal as well as unequal outcomes in life, and that this form of justice that he advocated depended upon people not knowing certain things that we feel we should know and often take for granted. But I think, I mean, picking up this point, Gary, I think one of the difficulties with meritocracy is that we actually use the word equality when we speak about equality of opportunity, because I wonder sometimes whether we're really chasing the wrong kind of opportunity. We can be tempted to think that a just education requires that everyone must have the same opportunity to become, say, the Chief Justice of New South Wales. But isn't it better to think in terms of this, that each person is owed an education by society that will facilitate their leading a life filled with genuine goods in the actual circumstances that they will face, and I think if we think of equality of opportunity in that sense, the notion of equality is in a way not diminished, but the expectations around the notion of equality of opportunity, I think, are more realistic, that it's for the circumstances of life as people find themselves living.
The issue for me is the question owed. I mean, to what extent are we obligated? This is the crucial one. Are we saying that there is, for instance, deserved and undeserved merit? Because we're heading down that path. And once you break it all down, you say, okay, well, look, undeserved merit are things like an inheritance. Maybe I should tax you and take that away. Or you got lucky and you wouldn't mind if I taxed you. And then, but what about intelligence or personality or, pray, good looks? I mean, we don't make those. They are inherited also, but it's more difficult to tax them. So once you bite into the elements of merit, it's hard to then say what bit of those is owed someone else. I immediately come back to an insurance principle that says, okay, I think I prefer that I could, if things go wrong, I've got something to fall back on. But beyond that, every element of merit that I want to use as an excuse to say that I have an obligation to pay for someone else's, say, university degree, is contestable. And I guess I return to my point. Fortunately, in our society, we do contest these quite vigorously. And fortunately, in our society, I think we are inclusive. I don't think we exclude people from our major institutions other than on some, reasonably open measures of, say, marks at school or whatever. We don't say you're excluded because you're female or because you're gay or because you're black or whatever. So we do tend to trawl for the greatest amount of talent. At the margins, maybe we get that wrong, but I think we're in a very good situation.
When you talk about deserved merit and undeserved merit, which I think is an important distinction, you talk about intelligence, but critics of meritocracy increasingly, like Michael Sandel, argue that in fact the opportunities that are afforded by people who enjoy better outcomes in their own lives are more readily transmissible to the next generation, and so that intelligence becomes not something so much as deserved as something that is earned, cultivated, and transmitted. Is that a realistic criticism, Stephen?
I don't think so. I think where I find the discussion difficult is to understand what the alternatives might be. So I've now read 3 books on the terrors of the meritocracy, and it's a sham and a shame and a myth, etc. But not one of them offers any realistic alternative. It's hard to understand what Michael Sandel or any of the other critics of meritocracy see it being replaced with. Teachers, getting back to the education example, students study, teachers mark examinations, and they give higher marks to the students who do better. What else should they do? What other system would work that would please them? And you're mentioning this idea of equal opportunity, which gets mixed up with merit, but really is a different thing, isn't it? And Sandel cites R.H. Tawney, who's an English Christian socialist, wrote about equality of condition and distinguished it from equality of opportunity. And the idea is that everyone should be able to have some dignity and hold their heads up high and consider themselves participants in some kind of common culture and common venture. That's a great wish. It's hard to see how that would be accomplished by not having examinations, or by what was Sandel's main solution to his criticism is to change the tax system and to admit students by a random system to competitive universities. Those are very minor, kind of sad little attempts to change the system. It's what's the alternative, I guess, is what I keep asking. And there isn't one, is there?
It's hard to see what the alternative would be. And I mean, you're right, Sandel does advocate for this idea of the equality of condition, which allows for people to live lives of decency and dignity, which requires a sharing of public spaces in common. What it strikes me is that, of course, that Sandel is writing on the basis of his experience of teaching for 40 years at Harvard. Another critic of meritocracy is Daniel Markovits, who teaches at Yale. And these are the very institutions in the United States, Stephen, that you were referring to, the sorts of institutions that we don't really have in this country and that don't face those same issues of selection and the transmission of privilege. So perhaps Sandel needs to be, his criticisms of meritocracy need to be put in that context. Gary, what do you think? Equality of condition is something to which not just university administrators and teachers, but politicians can aspire to foster and cultivate in society?
This is too muddy. I agree with Stephen. We have to think about what alternatives offer themselves. And immediately I think for instruments, what instruments do we have here that might literally pay for those who are said to be not making it? Say they have reasonable merit. Maybe we find it difficult to work out what that merit is. Someone is going to have to pay for them to make it through, or that seems to be the argument. And the only instruments we have really are taxation. And as I say, that's contested constantly. And that depends on the broad view of the electorate. But we could not possibly argue that in the last 50, 70 years, that there's not an enormous amount of transfer from those who earn money to those who earn little or no money. We have an extraordinarily generous welfare system. And I can give you a figure from my recent role in the Charities Commission. Only 10% of the income of the charitable sector, which is nearly $180 billion a year, comes from donations and bequests. Most of the rest comes from government. So even in the charitable sector, government's a big deal. And the charitable sector is only a minor part, really, of the economy, of which government is a major part, and much of its business is tax and transfer. So we are 50, 70, 100 years down the track of a substantial transfer of funds to help those who for whatever reasons, are not doing as well. I think we've solved that one. The one we need to solve here is, are we giving sufficient to those of merit? Now, I'm not suggesting we pay more to the top end, but it's unlikely, I think, that we're losing talent anywhere now, because we've had such a wonderful revolution in the last 30 or 40 years, whereby, as I say, women, Indigenous, migrant, gay, etc., are now much more accepted, thank goodness, as they should be. So the opportunities are more readily available, and we draw from a much greater pool of talent. And from that, we all benefit.
I agree with what Gary's just said. And I think all of us who have reached a certain age have lived through it. When I was an undergraduate in the USA, there were universities that wouldn't accept women. They wouldn't accept Jews. There are lots of universities that wouldn't accept Afro-Americans, and all those things have gone now. And I'm pretty sure that we will continue to find ways to widen participation in higher education in a fair way to people with talent and motivation and ability. And we continue to do that, and we're improving all the time, and we're way better than we were. It's probably not a coincidence that the people who are most critical of merit are all from the left of politics. And in fact, some declared socialists, like Young, who actually invented the term meritocracy. And it fits with their ideas that somehow or other there's a utopian world out there. We just need to figure out how to do it, and everyone will be equal. But no one knows what that world looks like. Not Sandel, not Markovits, not Young. None of them actually describe what that world is. The closest Sandel comes to is advocating a national dialogue where people will all somehow sit down friendly and discuss new rules that will not involve merit. And it's hard to imagine how that would work and what it would produce at the end. So I guess my view is that most people, and that's why I gave you that example of the Pew poll at the beginning, where pretty much every single demographic group that you can even think of all agree that merit is what counts. If Rawls is right, and if you are behind a veil of ignorance and you are asked to develop a new society, and you are going to ask them what the rules of that society be, I don't think you'd get the ones he thinks he'd get. I think you'll get that merit counts more than anything.
Gary?
There's an interesting reflection, isn't there, about the fact that highly intelligent people marry each other. And there's almost this jealousy. Oh, you've gone to an elite university and you find a man or a woman, or a woman or a man, and you get married and you have children. So what? So intelligent people recreate, and less intelligent people recreate. And this seems to be a theme in the last 20 years or so that irks both left and right, actually. And I don't see the problem. Talent does exist in families because people tend to choose at their own level and they recreate, and, the genes determine so much of what else occurs. We shouldn't get tied up in that sort of supposed inequality between families. And I can tell you that's a debate I had just outside the Victorian cabinet about 30 years ago as a staffer. That Labor rights at that stage in Victoria, very left-wing state, were seriously thinking about how they could devise an instrument to somehow not have, smart people marry each other. I mean, it's just crazy stuff. and nasty stuff. I mean, really. So I think we have to accept that a meritocracy means that some people get to the top and some people fall out to the bottom. Now, we've been in a broadly meritocratic system for 100 years. We've had public education, for instance, for, since the early 1900s. There is a consequence of that. But we do have very strong welfare rules that say you can fall, but, there's a chance that you'll be picked up and helped through, either in the short term, get you back into work, or the long term, you go on to whatever, disability support, pensions, and so on. I think we have an extraordinarily good combination of letting merit shine, because ultimately that's what lifts us all, and looking after those who either can't shine or through bad luck or whatever will never shine. I think we've got it about right, but we must remain, I get annoyed, if you like, at the negative mindset that says, oh, this shouldn't happen. There shouldn't be rich people. And they should definitely not marry each other. The one thing we must remember is that wealth does not create poverty, and it's almost we've become so silly and so negative that we almost agree to that in the public space. That's just crazy stuff.
I think you make some very interesting points, Gary. Stephen, let me ask you, because I wonder whether underlying this is we've talked about American critics of meritocracy, and here we are in Australia talking about the way in which meritocracy functions in this society. And it occurs to me that perhaps one of the differences is that in the United States, there's a very different conception with a different commitment to levels of welfare. There's accordingly a very different conception of justice from the conception of justice that we have in this country, and that our conception of justice is reflected in the generous welfare state that we have, and the amount, as Gary has indicated, that government puts into the work of charities. Do you think there's an ideological difference between these two countries, the United States and Australia, that helps to explain the different conceptions of meritocracy and the different responses to it?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I associate that with meritocracy. We have almost a unique welfare system in that just about all of the welfare is means tested, and so it's allocated on what's perceived to be a basis of need. So if you're unemployed and you have no other means, then you'll get some welfare. It's very different in most European and American countries, where it's actually based on reciprocity. And then what you get if you lose your job depends on what you put in when you are actually working. And if you were never working, then you are going to receive a very small welfare. So there is a huge difference between Australia, but it's not just Australia and the US. It's Australia and Holland, the Netherlands and England, and all the other countries that have some reciprocity and some expectations from people that they would contribute to society. We're almost unique in having no expectations that you will have ever contributed anything, and you're still entitled to welfare. So it's different. But I still come back to the main issue. We have to allocate scarce resources because, as you said in your introduction, Peter, they're scarce, and we're not going to be able to have everyone having them. As far as I know, there are three ways you can do it. In a state of nature, you can just do it by dominance and brute force. Those who, in Wordsworth's words, those take who have the power and those keep who can. In a kind of more ideological run society, you might get allocated the rewards of society if you show the ideological purity and goodness, and go and recite the right words in your next communist meeting. You might get ahead that way. In our society, it's done by talent and achievement. And I can't see how we would prefer the other two.
Yes. Let's talk about a particular case. We have 500,000 people broadly on the National Disability Insurance System. That's about $30 billion a year. There's now pressure to have second-tier disabled, so-called second-tier disabled people brought in, of which there are 4.5 million. We could be looking at 5 million Australians who, whether deserving or not, I'm just trying to put that aside, who will have, if you like, a claim on the rest of us. Now, that's a very sensitive issue, and I raise it quite deliberately. Pretty soon, we will find that we are not able to afford what we once did, which was to look after people on the basis of need, the point that Stephen raises. We're very close to the mark now at $1 trillion in debt and $30 billion of the NDIS, and probably triple that coming up for the second tier disabled, if that were ever to happen, of making very hard choices about how much money we can transfer without crueling merit or the rewards to merit. So this is a really good debate, because we have to think very seriously now about how much we take from whom, including future generations, from whom we are taking a great deal at the moment.
And you referred earlier to the amount of government funding that underlies the charitable sector in this country. Presumably, if that reaches a limit beyond which it can't grow any further, then the impact on the charitable sector in this country will be enormous.
Yeah. Well, let me give you a little example here now. I won't name names, but let's think of a billionaire who's done very well in IT, and then he makes his money and he says, I'd like to see the following world. The world would be run on the basis of renewable technologies. And he actually wants to use his power to close down non-renewables, which will probably put a lot of people out of work, probably cause blackouts, and may well have a severe impact on our economy. And that person's philanthropy is subsidised by the taxpayer. So the question of what is good use of money never goes away. And that's an example, it could be argued, of someone using their power to exclude others, to deny them work that would otherwise have occurred. That's something that interests me greatly.
Stephen? In my view, reciprocity is just as important as solidarity in a community. People need to feel, and know they need to feel, that their contribution to the general society is recognized. Therefore, I do believe that most European countries and the US and Canada have a better system than we do, in that, at least for things like unemployment insurance and so on, your contribution is taken into account. It's not in Australia. And as Gary's pointed out, if you can get something, you will try to get it. And the number of people who can be benefited is infinite. So they'll just keep trying to get more and more. I'm not sure that it's exactly an issue of merit. It's more of an issue of a lack of reciprocity, it seems to me, in the welfare system. Do you think that reciprocity is the principle that underlies the Australian tradition of the fair go? Once upon a time, I mean, when we had friendly societies and people independently joined together to look after each other in times of need, yes, it was all about reciprocity. You put in when times were good, and you got things given to you when times were bad. And it was all done outside of the government. It seems to me that rather than seeing the government's involvement of charity as a good thing, I think co-opting the charity has been a terrible thing, because it's taken away agency from these charities. It's made them essentially have to pay the piper who's paying the tune. And I don't know that, and it's taken away any sense of reciprocity. Gary, does the charitable sector underpin our notion of a fair go? Can we have a fair go without a charitable sector?
Peter's right. I mean, there's a lot of effort in the charitable sector now placed on advocacy, and the advocacy is for more government money. It's called a charity ball. I mean, it goes round and round, so that the charity says, I identify a need because I'm a researcher of the charity. And then you go to government and say, by the way, I can fix this need if you give me some money. I have the solutions. And around it goes. And it's a big pile of money. So voice is rewarded in democracy. the biggest voice is rewarded in democracy. And of course, if you tell a tale of woe, it's very difficult for a politician to then deny it. So charity, many charities are wonderful. Many people working in charities are wonderful. Of course that is so. But I do see creeping in the last 15, 20 years, this tendency to do little charity other than lobby for someone else's money. And of course, it's indirectly. You're no longer asking the donor. And in some cases, you're not even demonstrating your good works. You're just simply lobbying. That's my angst with the sector.
I'm glad that Gary mentioned democracy, because it's another acrocy, isn't it? Democracy, autocracy, meritocracy. But democracy in this particular context can have lots of different meanings. So there are lots of democracies in the world. They're not all the same, and some aspects of democracies are not very democratic. Our Senate in Australia must be one of the least democratic legislative bodies in the whole of the Western world. It's so unrepresentative and but we still don't knock democracy, even though it's not perfect. We realize it's not perfect and we keep trying to perfect it. Why isn't meritocracy the same thing? I mean, surely giving the rewards to people who merit them is a good idea. It's not perfect, as I pointed out in the very beginning of this, that there are issues that could be looked at and maybe fairness can be improved. But we can't, why throw out the entire idea of meritocracy, which seems to be the only fair way to me to allocate to social resources, because it's not perfect. You'd have to throw out democracy because it's not perfect either.
And with a commitment to democracy, I think also a commitment to the inequality of outcomes. In fact, former CIS scholar Peter Saunders has argued that while still committed to the idea of a fair go, Australians today are less committed to equalising outcomes. And he argues that today the fair go encompasses both the idea of meritocracy and the notion of fair exchange based on the right to lawfully obtained private property. And I think if Saunders is right, and I think he is, that means the commitment to meritocracy surely entails not just an acceptance of inequality, but also, and we touched on this already, the intergenerational transmission of privilege, leading to certainly in the United States and perhaps here in time, the creation of an enclaved elite. Is this a reflection of the way in which Australians are changing their conception of these conventional notions, such as a fair go? Gary, do you think?
I think expectations have changed. I do like the old notion that, Jack is as good as his master. Now, that was a statement about the humanity of the person, but there was no sense in which Jack had any rights over his master's property. But so much of our property and our lives are shared now that there is a contest, a constant contest for the master's property. And that can breed resentment. And we have moved from, I think, a more egalitarian sense of I'm not rich, but I feel as good as the rich person, to a means by which I can get hold of some of that money, which is through democratic means, through taxation. That's the slippery slope. And to some extent, if you can get something from government and make enough noise, you'll get it. And it does force out, I think, the better angels to some extent. It does force out charitable thoughts. It does. People are lost to the idea that much of their work happens in and around families. It's not about governments. It's not about tax and transfer. You can build a good life through good relationships, for instance. I'd like to see that sort of, it doesn't have to be in the public sphere, but I'd like to see that come back. There are good lives out there that have nothing to do with equality, formal equality, or meritocracy, or taxation, or institutions. We've almost forgotten family and local life.
And yet taxation surely is one of the principal means by which resources are redistributed within a society. And so presumably it's one of the principal mechanisms available to government to tweak society and to make the sorts of adjustments that politicians often get elected to office saying that they want to make.
Yeah, sure. But as I'm saying, we've had a good crack at this now for many decades, and perhaps older people say, oh, okay, where do I derive the most joy? It's probably, family, grandchildren, partners, close mates, or whatever. Now, maybe I'm at a point where, I'm well off and I'm aging and so on, and I can concentrate on those things. But that's also true of young people. Young people love their friends and go out with their friends and probably spend a bit too much money on smashed avocado or whatever. But there's so much in private life. There's so much in family life, which in a way, I'd love to see more discussion about it, because we should reveal it more to the public sphere to say, look, you mob can go on all you like about tax and transfer, but there's another life here. There's a good life being had in Australia by people from top to bottom. They're making it by themselves. And we have liberties in this country which allow us to have those private lives, which is, Stephen, reflecting on your earlier thing about, what are the alternatives? Well, the communist states aren't so good because they don't like private families. They don't like private lives. They don't like private associations. They want state to run everything. So, yeah, I wouldn't mind we just sharpening our elbows and pushing out the whole notion of government has a solution for everything. They don't.
Well, I'm not going to argue with that because I agree, but government is not the solution to everything, and a bit more independence and outside of the government would be useful. But I don't think even if Peter Saunders were around now that he might say the same thing, because all of my ideas about how Australians think have been changed over COVID. And the last 2 years have been a kind of a revelation to me that I didn't really understand, even having been here for 50 years almost, how people think, and that they were willing to throw overboard all of their rights and all of their freedoms in order to escape a fairly minor threat, and were willing to give up so much authority to essentially dictatorships. And so I'm not so sure that your description of the Australian view is still apposite.
I'm inclined to agree with you, and I'm actually, because I think that, in fact, our response to COVID over those 2.5 or nearly 3 years, it'll soon be 3 years, displayed or betrayed, perhaps even to use a stronger word, aspects of the Australian character which had really hitherto been cloaked. And I think the impact of COVID on our society is something that we will be contending with for a very long time to come. One of those, of course, is the enormous extent to which government intervened to fund a halted economy. And I think that sense of dependence on government funding is something that will now be very difficult in cultural terms, let alone political and economic terms. But in cultural terms, I think it'll be hard to undo.
Well, I think I was thinking, Peter, as well, which isn't really discussed as much as that point, but it's more in tune with this discussion. And that was seeing, for example, the Queensland government welcoming American actors to fly in and out of Queensland during COVID, when Queenslanders weren't permitted to go to their mother's funeral or somewhere outside of the state. We always joke, being stuck in Western Australia, that we could dress ourselves up as tennis players, because then you can fly wherever you like in Australia. Yeah. So getting, from our idea of a meritocracy and our discussion tonight, we're seeing quite a different thing play out in real life, where some people are given way more freedoms and way more latitude than others in a society which prouds itself in its egalitarianism. It's quite an eye-opener for me.
Yeah. Look, I agree. I've been shocked at this many Australians' response to COVID and the powers of government. Absolutely shocked. I just assumed, and I lobbied a lot of members of the LNP opposition here in Queensland to just say, for God's sake, open the borders. And they obviously had polling that said that Queenslanders wanted those borders closed. They were quite happy to keep the demon, that southern demon COVID, from our sacred shores here in Queensland. And I just presumed that we were bigger than that, but it seems we're not. I think it's. I think you're right, Peter. Stephen. It's revealed ourselves in a not especially kind way. I think I don't know how much further we can take that debate, because we're going to rely on each other eventually, and as a nation and as citizens. But it was not a happy period for us. I don't think we're at our best by any means.
I wonder if I can use that as a stepping point to an area to an issue that we've sort of skirted around, really, but it's the moral principles underlying meritocracy. Because I think one of the reasons that people worry about meritocracy, and coming back to this question of unequal outcomes, is that somehow and we talked about desert earlier, that desert is a reflection of moral worth. You gain something, you win a prize, you earn a vast sum of money, and somehow that reward is a reflection of personal worth. And those who get those rewards say that they deserve them. Yet both Friedrich Hayek and John Rawls argued, in fact, that merit had nothing to do with justice, and that rewards do not reflect what people deserve. Now, for classical liberals, and a principle, of course, for which the CIS stands staunchly, committed to individual liberty, the right to own property, the rule of law, does a successful defense of unequal outcomes arising from distribution of talent and luck mean dispensing with the idea that what people earn reflects what they morally deserve? Do we have to sever that nexus between rewards and moral desert, as it were? Gary, what do you think?
No, we don't have to. Now, I'm more utilitarian. I think the proof is that we can help more people, whether deserving or undeserving, by rewarding merit. The weight which we give to merit, whether or not we say it's morally, superior to anything else, I'm not so sure. But whatever weight we attach to it, to me, is sufficient to say that if we reward merit, the vast majority will benefit. And I think that's morally uplifting.
I agree completely. I'm desperately trying to think of some other way to do it. We progress is in our ability to look after people's needs and to treat people well by, in fact, rewarding people who make a contribution to the general good. So yes, Bill Gates might get very wealthy because of his contribution, but I'd much rather use Word to do my articles than to type on a typewriter. And I believe we've all benefited from those inventions. Same thing goes true for the vaccines that hopefully helped us get over COVID. I noticed that the people who developed the AstraZeneca vaccine were on the cover of Time magazine. That's a very high amount of esteem and social capital that they've gotten, but they deserve it, don't they? And that helps other people, motivate other people to also make contributions that benefit the whole of society. I can't understand how we would expect to get the benefits that we enjoy if we don't reward those who make those contributions to the general good.
But if I can just slightly dampen this utilitarian zeal and come back, say, to Bill Gates, couldn't it be that, in fact, it's not so much that what Gates has accomplished is a measure of his merit, but simply a measure of his ability to cater to the demands of the market, and that's why he's made a great deal of money?
Why isn't that meritorious? I don't get it.
I think it's wholly meritorious. It took brilliance, I presume, but wholly meritorious that he could satisfy the needs of billions. And of course, he doesn't consume his billions of dollars. He reinvests them. I presume that money is available to others to borrow so that they may go and create wealth as well. We tend to forget that element of wealth, that the money is not sitting in castles. It is literally being reinvested all the time. And he's doing good by simply allowing his money to sit in other forms of investments. That's doing good too.
Which brings us back to the principles of individual liberty, the rule of law, and the right to own and dispose of one's private property. I mean, without those principles, it seems that meritocracy will be choked and won't be able to flourish in any sense at all. And we can see that enormous financial success is in some ways the result of that. Gentlemen, we've got just time for one last question, which I'd like to ask, because if we are to retain a commitment to the idea of merit, and I think that our conversation has brought us to the point where we would affirm that commitment, and if we want to affirm that effort and ability are of value in our society, and again, I think we want to affirm that, perhaps we need to widen our understanding of merit beyond the high-achieving credentialism with which it has come to be associated. The American scholar Wilfred McClay has argued for the recognition of other forms of merit. McClay says this: the strictly local and rooted virtues of those who give deeply of themselves in acts of service to their own communities. That's the definition of merit that he ventures. Can we rethink merit so that it can function in a much broader way, so as to alleviate concerns about equality? Because these concerns are real, and it seems that for as long as the concerns are being aired, meritocracy will come under this sort of sustained criticism and even attack. Can we still depend on merit? Let me ask you that as a final question. Stephen.
Yes, I only if for no other reason than you don't have anything else to depend on, and this is what we've got. My view is that things have improved tremendously over my lifetime. Things will get fairer. Things that people got away with in the past in terms of discrimination would not be able to get away with it now. That in general we are aware of the needs to try to include as many talented people as we can, because we need all the help we can to keep society going. So I do believe it's not beyond us to keep improving merit. But I do, as I said earlier, to me, it's in the same category as democracy. It's never going to be perfect, but it's going to be, what was Winston Churchill's phrase, better than all the other possibilities.
Gary, a final thought from you.
Localized examples of merit are everywhere, but they're hard to find sometimes. So I don't doubt that merit is shining in locales and families all the time. But I agree, it's not in the public purview. We don't read it on the front page of the Australian, or we don't see it on television, but it's there. Now, we might think about how we could make that more readily available, but I think it's there. It's in the ether. We share it by social media. And I can tell you, after 4.5 years in the Charities Commission, there's wonderful work being undertaken. We don't often know about it.
Well, Stephen and Gary, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thank you very much for joining me for this fascinating conversation this evening about meritocracy in this CIS webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, for decades, the CIS has been a fiercely independent voice working hard to promote sound classical liberal principles. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel and then click the notification bell. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our classical liberal cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.